everybody. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bacasa. Today, we've got Mel Hayner on the line. Mel, you're the owner and operator of the Driftless Fly Fishing Company. You guys have been in business for quite a while. You've been in business for 10 years at the fly shop, but you've had over 20 years of guided service in business, and you've been fishing for around 50 years. And your focus has been primarily the Driftless region area, which is a ton of spring creeks. In fact, the largest concentration of spring creeks in the U.S., I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some of the history of the Driftless? And then what we're going to do is jump into the Driftless area itself, talk about how and what you're doing there and what might be of interest for some people to go visit that area. And then the last section of the call, we're going to go through and talk about one of the tips that you have regarding Spring Creek stealth approaches, because water's so clear and fish can be pretty skittish, etc. So looking forward to this call. How you been?
Pretty good. The weather's holding us back a little on this season. We had 4 or 5 inches of snow about a week ago and then a 2-inch rain. So that kind of muddies the water up for a couple of days. But other than that, we're starting off pretty good. We're getting blue-winged olive hatches, and fishing's been real good when the weather was right.
Mm-hmm. In the Driftless area, talk a little bit about that history. Why did they call it the Driftless, and how was it developed?
Okay, and the reason being, it's a geological term used because there is no glacial drift here. And the drift is a rubble that's the pulverized rock and everything that's crushed by the glaciers advancing from the north. And those glaciers stopped about 40 miles north of here. And the theory is because of the Great Lakes, it absorbed a lot of that moisture. The Driftless area is part of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and just a little bit of Illinois that was not glaciated during that time. So it also did not compact the ground, and so it's very porous limestone underneath the dirt. There's a lot of porous aquifers running underground, and it also creates these cold water streams. The water comes out of the ground in springs about 42 degrees, and so it doesn't get too hot in the summer, and it doesn't freeze up in the winter, and it's perfect habitat for trout. And a lot of insect activity. It's very nutrient-rich, biomass density, and so you can get pretty big fish in pretty small water here, which is one of the things that I really love about it, is that fish are very healthy, and we have brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout. The brook trout is the only native trout that was here in Minnesota before European settlement. But the browns were stocked at about the turn of the century, the 1890s. And then the rainbows are also continued to stock, but they don't reproduce here. So we have 99% wild brown trout and brook trout, and then we have some stocked rainbow trout, which they usually put in areas where the resorts are, the state parks, where kids fish a lot, and the family fishing is more.
Yeah. And the brook trout scenario, they're native. Do they get pretty sizable in nature, or are they?
Well, a big one here is a 12-incher. The biggest I've seen is about 16 inches.
Wow.
Okay. So they generally are smaller than the rest. And an average is probably 8 or 10 inches for the brook trout. So they are smaller. They mostly are in the headwater areas where the purest water is, because they're kind of a canary in the coal mine of water quality. And it's one of the reasons they introduced the browns, is because they're more resilient and degraded habitat. So the brook trout are generally in the headwaters where it's nice and clean and cold. And they have some areas that are designated as heritage brook trout streams that are the original strain. The brook trout were also introduced from the East Coast, the eastern brook trout, around that time. They brought them in milk jugs from milk containers on trains and dumped them in. So some of them, they're not a pure Minnesota strain, but they did a DNA study that did find out that some of them are the descendants of the original strain of Minnesota brook trout. And so those areas are mostly protected for catch and release only. No.
Okay. Okay.
Yep.
Are there a lot of fly specific waters in the driftless, or is it a
There's
combination of
none
fly and
that's indicated for
conventional?
fly fishing only, and they did try to make some of that, and of course they had a big uh, controversy about that, and the farmers and people in rural Minnesota said, "Well, we don't want those Minneapolis people telling us how to fish, and we can't get those expensive fly rods, and we want our kids to be able to dunk night crawlers, and so
Right.
they did not." But at that time, and it's about 10 years now, that they designated some catch and release only water. They also have some water with slot limits, 12 to 16 inches. You
Okay.
got to release them all between that, and you keep one big one and three small ones under 12 inches or one over 16 inches. So that really was one of the things that really helped the fishing here. And now we have many more big fish than we did 20 years ago.
Okay.
Because one of the things that happens is that the bass and the walleye, of course, the land of 10,000 lakes, they're king. The bass, the walleye, the northern pike, and those don't open until mid-May season. So trout season opens April 15th for harvest. It's catch and release year round here now, but the harvest season is a traditional trout season opener. And a lot of the people that are generally fishing walleye and stuff in lakes come here during that month
Okay.
or so. And so we get a lot of pressure during that time. And so they did designate some of those catch and release areas and slot limit areas to protect some of those big fish and
Mm-hmm.
the reproducing fish. Because one of the things that happened was you had good habitat and people would come in early season and take out all the big fish. And so to eat them, it's just traditional, a keeper, so to speak. And so then there would be no predatory fish to eat the small fish. So it would
Right.
become out of balance where you got a high density of fish, but they're all small and they deplete the forage base so that none of them get big. They're all stunted. So with a slot limit or a catch and release, you preserve those predatory fish and you get a more normal balance of fish, of big and small, and
Mm-hmm.
you reduce the numbers of the small fish. So you can keep some of those too. So it really worked
Yeah.
out great. I mean, some of these, like Trout Run is one that's in top 100 trout streams in the nation, and it has a lot more big fish than it did 20 years ago,
Oh, that's
because of
really
those
cool to see that
fish.
work. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So obviously you've been pretty happy with that scenario. That helps
Oh
you
yeah.
out.
Yeah, and again, it's one of the reasons that we're getting more of a national reputation as a world class fishery because of those special regulations have really improved the fishing, and the science of habitat improvement has improved over the years. And we have a lot of those habitat improvements here from Trout Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, and some other outdoor entities that are doing collaborating on some of the habitat improvement, which used to be more 20 years ago was more of a put and take. There was stocking, and there wasn't a big survival rate of those stock fish. So now,
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons that they had to do a lot of the habitat improvement is because we're getting more flooding, and whether it's climate change or what, part of it is ethanol. Because of the coming on of ethanol, a lot of more plowed ground. People used to have
Okay.
pasture or CRP, and now they're plowing it all up in row crops, tiling and draining it, and it changes the hydrology and runoff into the streams quite a bit. So we get high water more, and they're making these streams more resilient to that high water that you get the 100-year flood every 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Did you find that in the past it was more kind of state managed, and now with some of these national influences like Trout Unlimited, et cetera, and has that had a significant change on the conservation side, from your opinion?
yes, yes, and we have very active um, clubs here, the Trout Unlimited Minneapolis. Here in Rochester and South is a Hiawatha chapter, and you got the Windcrest chapter, and over in Wisconsin, the Coulee region, and all of those. Very active in those habitat projects, a lot of volunteers, a lot of guys that really getting out there with the DNR and working on that habitat improvement. And it really has, if you improve a section like in Preston here, they improved a section in town where there was a lot of erosion, there was a lot of trees falling in, a lot of sediment accumulating, and they did a project just through town to take out all those dead trees and the sediment, which improved the other 20 miles of the stream downstream because you're not getting all that stuff coming in. So just a small portion can affect the rest of the river in that way. So it was pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's great to see. I tell you, I've interviewed quite a few people about the Driftless recently in the past year, and it's just grown and grown in popularity. People are starting to discover it. So I'm excited to kind of get out there and explore. I know you gave me an invite. I've had some other invites.
Right.
So we're going to take advantage of it here soon. But it's one of those, there's too many areas to go and visit in my book right now.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things here is that, it's getting more popular and there's a lot of public access. But most of the times, especially during the week, you can find a pretty good stretch of river by yourself, and there's not other people. It's not crowded like some of these western streams, and it's still fairly undiscovered in some ways. And there's enough water to spread everybody out. So it is one of the.
It's accessible.
Yeah,
it's accessible. I mean, you can fly into Minneapolis, and then how long's a drive to get into?
We're about 2 hours from Minneapolis.
Okay.
But there's closer water. There's some north of I-90 that's very good water up in Whitewater State Park and along the Mississippi. Some of them run straight into Mississippi. So within an hour of the Twin Cities, you can find quality trout water. We just kind of stay south of I-90 because of that pressure is more towards the cities, and Rochester's a town of, say, over 100,000. So those streams north of I-90, which runs right along the bottom here, get more pressure than they do south of I-90. So we mainly guide south of I-90 to the Iowa border. We even go into Iowa sometimes. Iowa has some pretty good streams too.
Can you describe the landscape a little more? Is it a lot of fingering, kind of springs here and there, or are they primary large spring creeks that are running a single line, et cetera? I'm kind of curious to understand how the landscape is and whatnot.
Okay. Yep. They call it bluff country also. And there's several publications, visiting bluff country. So most of it in our area is big bluffs, and the streams are running between the bluffs and little almost canyons, valleys, and the springs come in along the way. Some of them are gushing right out of the side of the bluff, that you can see them coming in, and other ones are underwater where you can only tell they're there if you're wet wading and it gets colder. So that as many of the streams are more water upstream than there is downstream, because some of those springs and some of that water sometimes goes underground and is flowing underground. But that's why it's a very ecological sensitive area. If you get a manure spill from a hog farm, it goes underground. It can travel 20 miles in these aquifers and pollute a lot of water. So, so that's one of the reasons that there's some pretty tight regulations on that type of thing. We had a couple of fish kills. We had one last year up on Rush Creek, and they did not really discover exactly who did it. But it was some pesticide that was sprayed, and then we got a 2-inch rain, and it killed not only the fish, but all the bugs in the stream. So now Trout Unlimited, our chapter, Hiawatha chapter, has a hotline, and we hand out the cards for you can call right away if you see a fish kill, because part of the problem was if you don't discover it for 2 or 3 days and it's a 2-inch rain, whatever was in there is gone by the time they do the testing. So they're trying to be a little more vigilant on catching people that are doing damage. And that's one of the things that, is a hazard of our area. So you got big bluffs, you got small spring creeks feeding the bigger streams. Here south of I-90, we got 2 different watersheds. One is the south branch of the Root River, and one is the south fork of the Root River. The south fork is a little more wild over there. It's more bluffy. You got less water, but it's usually runs clearer than the South Branch. The South Branch comes out of Forestville State Park. You got quite a few Spring Creek tributaries that come in, but really the South Branch of the Root River is just a bigger spring creek.
Okay.
It's kayakable. We use a drift boat on it. It's big enough for that. And then the small streams are more walk and wade, maybe as wide as a 2-lane highway or even just a sidewalk. And you got
Okay.
pockets, you got pocket water. And then as it moves towards the Mississippi, you get more into that historic floodplain of the glacial melt, which is flatter. And Wisconsin's the
Okay.
same way a lot of times. You got more meandering meadow streams than you do here, and a little higher in the watershed. We're more rockier and faster. And then as it goes down towards the Mississippi, it kind of flattens out before
Okay.
it dumps into the Mississippi usually. So it's beautiful country, and it's very different than the rest of Minnesota. And,
Yeah.
People don't know that about it.
Right. Right. And Minnesota's pretty well known for having some prolific entomology as well.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of bugs, right? So,
that's right.
talk a little bit about some of the differences of fishing spring creeks. I think would be really interesting to hear. You talked about, hey, you don't know you're even buy a supply until you feel the temperature change, et cetera. Are those some of the things that you kind of look for or historically know about to target areas in and around that, et cetera?
Right. It is kind of important to know where the springs are, primarily because in the summer, some water warms up to maybe 55, even 60 degrees, and those fish will be near the spring creeks. The springs, underground springs coming in, keep that water cooler, and especially the brook trout will be in those areas. And that's one of my guides uses a stream thermometer. He just puts it on his boot. And when he's walking, then he picks it up on a rock and takes a look to see what the temperature is, because you really can find fish when you find a cooler water. And the same thing in the wintertime, the water gets about 32 degrees and it's coming in on the springs about 42 degrees. And the same idea is that where it's a little bit more tolerable, they're going to be more active. When they get very lethargic, when that water is very cold, they're not going to move much. But if you get in a series of springs there, the other reason to know where those springs are is for rain runoff. Like today, I know the areas where it's going to clear first. And that's where the springs are at the headwaters, where there's not a lot of above ground water running in, the runoff, and the snow melt doesn't come through under the ground as much. So if you know where those areas are, even in a rain event, if the bigger tributaries are muddy, it's going to be clear in those upper parts where the springs are. So,
Okay. Yeah, you can go target those areas, et cetera.
yep.
I love the tip of the thermometer in the boot. I mean,
Yeah.
I use the thermometer
Yeah,
all the
Sam,
time,
he's
but I'm
my
always
guide. He does a great job. And me, I just kind of fly by the seat of my pants and go, because I know the area well enough to know
right.
where it should be colder and stuff like that. And he knows the area too. He just is a little more scientific about his approach.
Yeah.
Young
No, I
guys,
like
it's good
it.
to have them young guys around. They kind of give you some new perspective on things.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, you said some of the areas you're fishing out of a boat,
Yep.
but there's quite a bit of walk and wade. When you approach the waters from a boat, what are a little bit different for you in that Spring Creek scenario? Because you got to be pretty stealthy. So, are there some tactics you're taking into consideration there from a boat scenario?
Yeah, and that is important. That's one of the things that I have talked about before is stealth. And when you're in a drift boat, we usually land the boat above the big pool, and then we walk down and wade it back to the boat rather than floating through while you're fishing it. Now, you can cast from the boat when you're going through the big deep runs and stuff like that. And deep here is 6 feet, not 40, but
Okay.
30,
Yeah. Okay.
And when you're floating through there, you can cast to the edges a lot of times and still get fish. But for the big productive holes, you look for those deeper holes with riffles coming in, some wood and water and stuff like that. Especially when you're hunting a big fish, you don't really want to float through or row until you've fished that pot. And we do the same thing on the kayaks. We got Jackson kayaks that sit on top fishing kayaks, and they're perfect for our water because they're very shallow draft. And in drought years, you can even paddle through there, and they're quiet and they're very stealthy. So we usually do the same thing. We just stop, fish the pools, and then paddle through the bad water and fish the water that looks good. So you kind of be selective. You can cover a lot of water that way. The drift boat, it's kind of good for people who have some mobility issues.
Mm-hmm.
They can stay in the boat, just cast from the boat and sit in the chair and not have to walk too much. But
Yeah.
it also is a great way because it's very stealthy. And a couple of days ago, we were floating the South Branch, and we come up on two bald eagles. One was in the nest, and the other one was sitting out on the branch, and they didn't move till we got right underneath of them, you know. And so you're floating along. It's nice and quiet, and you see deer in the water, and it can be a real great way to cover a lot
Yeah.
of water, either in the kayak. And it's too cold right now for kayaking, so we use a drift boat so you don't have to get too wet if you can help it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And when you get out of the boat, are you guys walking down and fishing upstream, or are you fishing
Yeah.
downstream?
Right,
Okay.
fishing upstream because the fish are always facing upstream. So you got to
Mm-hmm.
approach them from downstream so they don't see you. And that's the only place they can't see is behind you. So if you
Right.
float through there, you're going to put them all down for a while. So that's what we usually do, right? We'll land above and then walk back from the stream away so you're not even putting your shadow on the water and get down below and fish up back to the boat
Okay.
rather than
Okay.
casting from the boat all the time, especially in the real prime water. We try and approach those from downstream and very stealthy. If you don't even get in the water if you don't have to. But with trees and weeds and stuff, sometimes the best casting area is in the water. But if you can cast from the bank, a lot of times you're better off than even getting in the water because they're going to spook. And
Yeah.
also the idea is that if you're approaching a pool, the bigger fish are going to dominate that pool. They're going to be at the top having first call coming in on bugs, and they're going to be in that cover. So if you fish the best water first, you're scaring all those smaller ones that are taking leftovers down at the bottom of the pool.
Right.
So you want to take them out before you approach that best water. You don't want to run right in and wade through them because they're like a bird. If you scare one, they all go. So if you
Right.
walk right up in through that tail out of that pool, and you might get a few nice fish there too, but generally the bigger fish are going to dominate the pool at the first coming in on the top of the pool. So
Yeah.
you want
Right
to
at the
kind of
head.
save that for your best cast and into the pool at the end. And that way you can cover all the water without spooking the main fish at the bottom.
Yeah.
So,
And then I'm assuming you're coaching up your clients. Hey, we're gonna fish into this back end of this pool. If you hook up, let's try and don't let it run up into the head.
right,
Let's yank that guy out of there, get him on the
right.
net, and
Yeah,
we're gonna keep moving up because we don't want to disturb them. Right.
right, right. And we do our little fly fishing Orvis 101 in the shop. And I got a little chalk talk on that where I show the stream and, the boulders and stuff and where they should be. And it's one of the great things about the driftless area is that once you begin to understand why they are where they are, they want cover from predators, they want access to the main current, and they want some protection from the current to stay out of the current, but access to the current. So you can really stalk the fish here. If you understand that of how to read the water, you can really stalk where they should be,
Yeah.
And if you're getting
Yeah.
a good cast in there where they should be and you're not hooking up, you switch flies because,
Yeah.
that's what it is. You
Yeah.
eliminate.
We're
Yep.
going to get into some of that stalking technique that you talked about earlier. So, you just mentioned switching up flies. What's the primary technique that you're using? Or are you primarily really trying to dry fly fish or dry dropper? Talk a little bit about that for me.
Okay. It depends a little on the season, of course. And, we're coming into the real prolific dry fly time. Now, for me personally, I'd rather get one on the dry fly than three on the nymph, but I'd
Mm-hmm.
rather get one on the nymph than none. So 80% of the time, we're going to be nymphing with an indicator. Now, the small creeks, especially, I don't use a dry dropper because of the two hooks. You got more chance of snagging up.
Okay.
You're going to be bouncing them undercut banks and stuff like that. You're trying to get that nymph down deep underneath the cover and stuff like that. And the other reason being, if you hook a pretty big fish in a small area, you got that other hook to worry about. And they're going to be digging in the weeds and going up under stuff. And if you got that other hook hanging out there, you got twice the chance of losing them. So I
Okay.
think you're better off to get a good cast and drift. Drift is real important. The way that it's coming through is real important. And so generally use one fly with the smallest indicator we can possibly use and about 80% of the time we're nymphing. Pheasant tail is probably your number one nymph. We got some that are specific to the area, one we call the Root River Special that we tie ourselves. Scuds are important here, and then your basic prince, hare's ear, any of those. Almost exclusively use the bead heads now to get down there. Unless they're taking those emergers. If you're getting them on the swing or they're hitting it as soon as it hits the water, many times we'll use that without the bead because they're just taking those emergers that are just an inch below the surface. And you'll see them kind of porpoising. You got to watch those rises real close to see if they're sipping them or they're opening their mouth, or sometimes they're just breaking the surface with their tail and they're taking them just subsurface. And so that's when we go to the non-bead like that. So you got to kind of follow the hatch. From now, early March, we get blue-winged olives, really small, tiny, 20s, 22s. And even a good pattern for that is a parachute Adams, Griffith's Gnat, midge patterns, stuff like that. And we get midges year round. Even in the winter, we'll get some little midge hatches and stuff that you use for dry fly fishing. But again, in the wintertime, we usually just in the early spring, we size down to 18s, 20s, very small, and use that indicator. Set the indicator about 45-degree angle where it's going to get down to the bottom in water. Most of the water you're going to be fishing with riffles is knee deep. That's about it. So you don't have to go too deep. You set it maybe halfway up your leader, and it's going to get down there.
Okay. Is the substrate of the river, is it a hard, limestone base, or is it gravelly? Kind of talk about that a little bit. You had mentioned some of the snagging scenarios.
Sometimes it's almost flat like a sidewalk where you got those limestone slabs and stuff. And most of it is kind of broken up, gravelly stuff. But of course, on them inside curves and stuff, you get silt. You can get some muck, that you get stuck in. And that's the experience here helps you avoid that a little bit. You got to get stuck a few times before you figure it out, maybe. But I have been stuck. And it's hard. Sometimes you're up to your knees in it. So you got to watch for that. But most of the time, it's going to be gravelly. It's going to be broken up. Sometimes big stuff, sometimes smaller pebbles. But easy wading most of the time. You just got to watch the muck, and, things like that. So.
Yep. And then you mentioned cut banks quite a bit. It sounds like that's pretty common because of the substrate and then the softness maybe of the outer edges, et cetera. Are you sometimes swinging, buggers and or streamers in under those cut banks too to pull stuff out, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, and especially in the hopper time when the grasshoppers are coming in late September and August. But the cut banks here will usually hold the bigger fish. Now, there's two kinds. There's a natural kind from erosion it's got rock on the surface, and they can get up under there where that current's going under. But also, many of the habitat improvement projects, they put in these lunker structures where they put almost a pallet of some wood in there, and then they put big boulders on top of it, so it holds the bank, but it still goes up under. And they go quite a ways back, and they provide protection from predators for fish. So the bigger fish get up under those, and many times the main current's going right up under, carrying the food to them, and they don't got to move. So the natural ones and the artificial ones hold a lot of fish, especially on sunny days. They're going to be in that shade. They're going to be up under those banks, and they get weeded up, and they'll just stay under there. But like say in hopper time, or even in some dry fly hatches, they'll come out from under, and you got to watch for them too. Well, they'll be under, but their nose sticks up right at the edge, a little foam line along the edge, and they'll be sipping those as they get trapped up against that cut bank, and they're not coming out, but they're just sipping those ones that are kind of still on the surface. So got to watch for those too, just a little nose sticking up there,
Yeah. And are you sometimes then purposely drowning your bugs, like putting your rod tip in the water and almost swinging, bugs through there?
We do soft tackles quite a bit too, and especially like right now, and the caddis really begin emerging around the 1st of May. And, we have the traditional Mother's Day caddis hatch, but really caddis are king here. I mean, they're looking for those as they emerge from them little tubes in the soft tackle, or even swinging that nymph. You got to be kind of strategically placed for that stealth, so that they're not spooking them. But at the same time, you can swing up under those cut banks and cover from upstream. And that's kind of the exception to the rule on fishing upstream. Is sometimes you want to swing it. And sometimes you just discover that by accident when you're letting it come by and they're taking it on the upswing, they're chasing it up. When it comes up, then it gets to the surface is when they think it's kind of getting away, and they'll hit it.
Yeah.
So,
that could be a deadly technique.
Yep.
Swinging those caddis. Even, a lot of times I'll throw a stimulator or something like that, and you start purposely drowning it, and gosh, it can just be really deadly. Yeah.
Yep. When they're taking it on the dunk, sometimes then you just switch to the emerger rather than to the adult. And sometimes that happens. They're taking the adults and they're splashy, and you're killing them on the dry flies, and then they quit. And then you discover that when it swings and dunks, they take it then. So you're kind of going through a cycle of what they're doing there. And once we were hitting the Hendrickson hatch, and my sister was with me, and she was catching them, and I wasn't, and I had been. And the reason being is that we hit 2 hatches back to back, and the fish switched. And my sister switched, and I didn't. I was saying, they're taking this a minute ago, and so then, and they switched to some mahogany dun or something that I had in the box, that really was different. But from the naked eye, you couldn't tell it was different. So again, you got to be flexible on that. If they're not taking what you got, but they're still rising, you got to switch. Mainly, most of the time, it's the size of the fly to me. Not the pattern so much, but they key in on one size, and it's more important than the fly itself. I mean, you want to get close enough, but many times if they're looking for the small ones, they won't take the big ones because it's out of place. So,
yeah, and this kind of rolls back to your comment too about the observation of how they're feeding, right? And that's super common with caddis, where you see tons of splashing and jumping fish and et cetera. And you're like, why aren't they taking my dry? Why aren't they taking my dry? Well, that's because they're feeding on the emerger. They're chasing it up and actually splashing out of the water, grabbing that, versus the dry or the adult where it's the gulping scenario, the bubbles.
Mouth open. You see the white of their mouth and the splash. Right. So close observation on the rising fish is an important way to pick a fly. Right.
Yeah, great. Wow, you obviously know the region very well. When you talked about the wading side in the other area that you fish, describe that a little bit more for us. And what's the access like if somebody wanted to do a DIY or something like that?
Okay, on the Minnesota DNR site, they have all the public access maps, and you can print those off of there, or in the shop, and any of the shops here, or the DNR, they have the booklet, which shows you all the public access. And so we've got a pretty good system here where the trout stamp money goes for habitat improvement and pays the property owners for access. And the easement is 30 feet from the high water mark. You can access it. You can't cut through the property. There's certain regulations on it, no dogs, stuff like that to annoy livestock and stuff like that. But there is, I think they said last count, there was like 700 miles of public access here. And, so you can get those maps. It's easily accessible. Where there's barbed wire, you'll see the little stairs going over the barbed wire to get in.
Yep.
So you don't have to open the gate or anything. And, it's a great system that the trout stamp money is designated for trout habitat and access. So it's kind of a pay-to-play thing, but it's also, very
There's a lot of infrastructure too, and development and easement, et cetera. Yeah.
Yep, and the hatchery. We got a hatchery over in Lanesboro, and that supports that too. So it's a great system, and we probably have more public access than a lot of states around here. And it benefits the landowner too, because they'll do that bank improvement, and it keeps from eroding a few rows of that corn back to him.
Right.
He's going to save that, and plus he gets paid some on the property taxes and stuff like that over the time. I'm not sure how they pay him, but they get an annual stipend for allowing access on their property. And
Okay.
once it's granted, it goes with the title of the ground, so the next generation can't rescind it. It's a permanent easement.
It's like grandfathered in. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. That's fantastic. Um, let's jump into the last part of the show here, Mel, and that's your tips and tactics on the Spring Creek stealth approach. And that's, something that I think every angler, when you get into fly fishing, you start to go, oh, the dream is to be on that crystal clear or gin clear Spring Creek and seeing the rising fish and sneaking up on there, getting in that stealth position, the perfect cast, the perfect drift, and watching that gulper come up and just take the line. So I'm excited to talk about what tips and techniques you've learned over the 50 years you've been fishing there since a 9-year-old boy. So I'm
Well, I
all
actually
ears, my
started on
man.
the West Coast in Oregon, but I've been here for 30 years. I've been fishing it for 30 years. Uh, but I did find that here, stealth is more important than anything because of the nature of the streams. They're shallow, they're clear, and in drought years, those fish are pretty concentrated. So you do most of the time have to approach from downstream. And you don't have to have a real long cast most of the time if you're coming from downstream, but you do got to have a gentle presentation so it lands without splash. And you got to kind of predict your drift, where it's going to drift, and mend or position your fly line so that it's going to have no drag. I don't often use split shot. You can use it, but I think a more natural drift and let the current carry that bead head where it's going to go is where the fish are going to be. We don't use a big thingamabobber indicators. We use a small foam indicator. It's very stealthy. It doesn't make much splash. It doesn't make much commotion, and move slowly. A lot of times too, wearing a blend-in color. Not wearing white or red or something blending in
Mm-hmm.
with the background. The season can help. Watching where the sun is and putting your shadow on there can make a difference, where you're approaching it. So when you approach the pool, the other thing we were talking about was, start at the bottom of the pool, because if you wade right in there in that water at the bottom, it's going to scoot them fish upstream and it sets off the alarm for the rest of them. So
Mm-hmm.
you want to fish the bottom tail out first, and you get a few fish out of there. You want to bring them out of that pool. The best water for the bigger fish is always going to be at the top of the pool, because they get first call. It's kind of like the corner office, they
Yeah.
can, because the other fish, they'll chase them out or eat them. So the bigger fish are going to dominate the pool and take the first call coming into the pool. And you don't want to just cast over those other fish to get to them. You want to work your way up gradually, covering all the water. And then once you get within reach of that prime water at the top, if there's a cut bank or a tree laying in there or something, make it your best cast, because you might only get one. And I don't know how
Mm-hmm.
many times, we've cast a little bit sloppy, you plop it in there, and here comes one shooting out of there, because you line spooked them.
Yep.
So stealth is important, and the drift is important. The other thing that I teach when we're guiding, especially, is that if you miss your mark, don't rip it right out in that prime water. Let it drift back to you before you pick up and cast again, because if you pick it back up and try another shot at it, you're disturbing that water, and any disturbance can put them down. They're not going to eat for a while. So
Yeah. Yeah.
they're wary fish, and those big ones especially, they got big because they're wary. They're in those deep hidey holes. They only come out at night sometimes. And, some of the younger guys do some of that night fishing with a headlamp, with a big mouse pattern, and they get some big fish that way.
Yeah. 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 I've heard the mousing and night fishing could be really good up
Yeah, and the
there.
state of Minnesota, you can only fish till 11 o'clock at night. So in the summertime, it doesn't get dark till 9:30, but that twilight from 9:30 to 11, is when those bigger fish become somewhat nocturnal and come out, and they look for big prey. They need
Mm-hmm.
calories, they need meat. So it's one of the fun things. I don't do it too much because I've caught big fish and I don't want to fall in the dark. I'm not that
I don't blame
desperate.
you.
But, it is a way if you just want big fish to get out there right at dusk, or a lot of times they'll see one, they'll get a follow on a streamer, my guides, and then they'll go back, because
They
they
know where
got to
it's
follow,
at.
but they go back and they know where it is, and they'll
Yeah.
try it with the big mouse or, big crawdad pattern or something to
something tasty in the evening, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We got some hanging in the
Put them
shop.
to bed with a cheeseburger, right?
Yeah, that's right. We got some replicas in the shop of some big 20s and 22-inch fish. And here, that's a trophy fish. Anything
Yeah.
20 and up is a good one,
Yeah, that's great. That's great. In those pools that you're fishing, are there typically a pretty sharp drop off into the pools? Is that where you're kind of targeting at the head of the pool?
Right. You got riffles, or you got even a little bit of a waterfall there, maybe 6 to 8, 10 inches. Some of them are bigger than that. But one of the things, that's where the fish will hang because of the oxygenation. It oxygenates that water, and that's one of the things that they gravitate towards is that oxygenated water. If it's still and it's not as much oxygen dissolved in that water, they're not going to stay there long. They're not going to feed there long. So the deeper pools give them cover from predators, oxygen, access to the food, and those different ingredients that those, especially the bigger fish, are going to look for or just naturally gravitate to those areas.
Yeah.
And again, that's one of the great things about the driftless area is as you go along, you start to understand why they are where they are. And there's not a lot of places to hide in these small streams, so you can target them, but you got to have a good stealthy approach and get it where they are in order to do that. So part of it is drift, drag, and presentation. That's probably the most important part of fishing here.
Yeah. Okay.
We get people from out west that say, boy, it's kind of tactical. It's kind of technical here, and it is. And that's the great fun of it. You know what I mean? You got to know a good roll cast. You can't always back cast. You got trees, you got weeds, you got a narrow alley there where you can put it in there. And so you got to be able to cast. Now, when we take out beginner clients, of course, there's some areas that are more open meadow areas that we'll take them to, and they're not going to get in the trees as much. But the more experienced guys, we just encourage them to hang a few flies in the trees for the old fly shop, Supporting your local fly shop.
That's right. I love it. Right. Come back through with the sweeper and clean shop.
Right.
Yeah. I think you mentioned it, and I maybe missed it, but the type of indicators you're using, are you using like a New Zealand indicator or a yarn indicator for a little softer presentation? Or you said, I remember you saying the smallest possible, but do you have a preferred method of yourself?
We mainly use a little pinch on foam. The New Zealand indicator is a good method. You got to put a little gink on it to keep it floating high because you got some pretty good current, and it's adjustable. But mainly we use foam. We do use some yarn, mainly in practicing. But even those foam ones, you got different sizes, and you can trim them with a little pocket knife and trim them down if it's spooking. But generally, and some people don't like them because they're not biodegradable. You got to be careful about not losing them in the water and stuff like that. So that's the advantage of the New Zealand is that it dissolves over time. It's just wool.
Yeah, and you can adjust it a little easier sometimes.
Adjust it without kinking your line. And then the pinch on foam ones, you can slide them too and adjust the thing, but you got to put a little granny knot in it to keep it from sliding. Once you move it, you lose some of that sticky on it, and it'll slide on you. But the main thing is to have it where it's not going to be splashy. A lot of guys come with a big thingamabobber or a big foam ball bobber type, and in a small creek, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Talk about that real quick. You said on the foam one, sometimes you put a little granny knot on it to keep it in place.
Yeah, if you slide it, you go from a knee deep to waist deep or even neck deep water. You want to put that indicator about the depth where it's going to run along the bottom at a 45-degree angle. So if you slide those foam indicators, then you can put just one loop knot in it and keep it from sliding, and then you can still untie that later and move it again. So they're not like one use. That's another thing people have against those is that, it's just one use and it's not ecologically sensitive. But we use them all day and just slide them and retie. And sometimes you got to redo it, but you stick it in your pocket rather than letting it go. So
so you're way up in the butt of your leader, right?
Yep.
So you're like, hey, if I throw a granny knot in there, it's no big deal. It's not compromising my line, etc. And I
Yeah,
can
it
then
doesn't hurt
back
a
that
thing.
off and adjust it again, do it again. Okay, I like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
That's another good tip. Another good tip. Well, Mel, hey, it's been great talking to you, man. Obviously, you've been in the region for a long time. You have a great depth of knowledge. How does somebody get a hold of you? Can you provide us with the information on the shop again? And yeah, hopefully we can get some people out there to visit you.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, Christian. And I invite you to come fish with us anytime you're coming down I-90 there. We're just 30 miles south of I-90. Uh, my website is minnesotaflyfishing.com. And the Driftless Fly Fishing Company is in Preston, Minnesota, also known as Minnesota's trout capital. And so you can, if you want to set up a guide trip or just get information on the way streams are, give me a call. My number's on the website. Shoot me an email with a date you have in mind when you're coming. And that's Melvin at minnesotaflyfishing.com.
All right. Well, hey, Mel, have a great evening and enjoy your weekend. Hopefully you can get out, get a little time on the water, maybe by yourself or with your sister, but outshine her this time.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we'll see
Yeah.
you. We'll see you soon.
Well, another thing I wanted to mention is that my sister also does some guiding. She does some specific things. And this Saturday, she's doing a women's only fly fishing beginner class. And that's kind of her mission in life, is to introduce more women to the sport. And so it's a great thing.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
So
That sounds awesome.
again, stop by and see us, Christian. We'll get you out there in our beautiful country, okay?
You got it, my man. We'll talk to you
All right.
soon.
Thanks
Take
for
care.
having me. Bye.